at least in the US, we can think of freedom of speech. And what does freedom of speech means when it is not directly linked to a human, but to an AI? And what does a linkage to a human mean? Does a human have to be completely responsible for that speech?
Welcome everyone to the AI Governance Podcast, where we discuss practical approaches for responsible AI practitioners. My name is Shankar, and today we'll be discussing AI soft law, the collection of frameworks, standards, and practices that can either be adopted by organizations voluntarily or be worked into regulatory or assurance requirements. Our guest today, Carlos Ignacio Gutierrez, is the leading authority on AI soft law. Carlos previously developed through the Arizona State University the most comprehensive database of global soft law programs for AI, which had over 600 entries, and he's researched this area deeply. So welcome to the podcast, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Var. It's great to be in this show, and congratulations on your journey to beginning it.
Thank you so much. So there is a lot of complexity in the AI law and policy landscape. Both the pace of change in terms of new model releases, as well as the policy response and the organizational adoption rate have kind of decreased significantly. So starting with generative AI and kind of those cutting edge generative AI systems, where should organizations look first to get started with AI governance and compliance?
That's a great question. Compliance is multidimensional, mainly because one has to decide what is you're trying to comply with, internal issues or externally mandated issues. And it's also something about language. Companies that are relatively new and are creating their products have a different way of communicating than individuals trying to work in the compliance world. So, for instance, when thinking about a service or product, these individuals that are creating the startup have to think, well, is this a fixed purpose or a general purpose AI model or system? And maybe potentially, if they are hardcore researchers, they may understand that. But differentiating between those two is incredibly important, because if it's a fixed purpose product, then one can think of a relatively limited or limited scope of things that product can do. And you can identify its risks relatively easier than the converse, a general purpose AI system. That just opens up Pandora's box of, well, what are the foreseeable things that it can do? What are its emergent capabilities, or what are the capabilities that I am thinking about, but maybe users or deployers in the context of the EU will discover and that I haven't identified before? That is something incredibly complex and multidimensional. Now, another thing to think about once we move away from the product is location. Where will my product be used? Can I geofence that to a particular place? And if I can't, what national laws, which are hard laws, do I have to comply with? In the EU, there's GDPR, and all big businesses in tech comply with GDPR regardless of where their customers are. So non-EU and EU customers for large corporations apply GDPR. But if you're working in the States, in the United States of America, there are also state laws that are incredibly important depending on what kind of AI system you have. If it's anything to do with biometric systems, you have to think about state laws in Illinois, Washington State, California, and Texas, and how that applies to your product and service. If you're thinking privacy, there's bespoke privacy laws in different jurisdictions, and compliance there takes a significant amount of time. And if you're thinking also of compliance in different ways, such as what type of quality you want to signal or what kind of production standards you want to have, well, you can think of standards made by IEEE or ISO and how you comply with those. And those are voluntary in the way But they can also become mandatory because if your company messes up in the Gen AI space, at least in some jurisdictions in the United States, complying with standards can become a way to decrease your penalties. So, do you want to decrease your penalties if you mess up by showing, hey, we tried our best, we didn't do this in an improvised manner? Or do you want to signal to consumers, hey, we're actually producing really good things at a really high quality level? And the way that we can show you that is that we have this certification or we comply with this standard and a third party actually audits us. So compliance is not a small matter. And for small businesses or for individuals that are starting in this generative AI world, it can take a significant amount of time and skill. And sometimes the best way to do this is to use third parties.
Great. So all of those are great places to start from an organizational standpoint. The nature of the product and its constituent elements, the jurisdictions of federal, state, and local, as well as kind of leading standards. Though, as you pointed out, for organizations with limited resources, it's even more important to kind of rely on third-party guidance on these sorts of issues. So zooming out a bit and changing our perspective from organizations to policymakers, from a policymaker's perspective, what are the objectives of AI governance and what roles do hard law and soft law for AI kind of play in it?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult one because as a policymaker, you have to choose to be either proactive or reactive. And for policymakers, being proactive is a very difficult feat because you'd have to visualize and foresee what problems are out there, and there aren't too many jurisdictions that think about problems in the future. Very, very, yeah. They thinking about future problems don't necessarily have advocates for. There are things that are now heavily advocated. We have seen in the past, for instance, for the EU with genetically modified organisms, the EU has a precautionary principle, and those have been banned for quite some time. And that was done with a look into the future. But, that hasn't been the norm. The norm has been reacting to things that are happening and where there's active push to do something after an accident or after new technology is introduced. And I think we can think of governance in two ways. The first way of governing is hard law. You just mentioned that, and hard law is what we know as normal governance. It is defined by jurisdiction, so laws in the U.S. don't apply to in the UK or in Brazil or in South Africa. And in order to create hard law, it takes a significant amount of time. You have to pass by either Congress or Parliament. There have to be different elements of society that have to opine on it, interest groups, and then there's an executive usually that finishes off that process. But it takes a significant amount of time. It requires more time to modify once created. It is difficult to modify, but it has a really important benefit that everybody in one jurisdiction has to abide by it. And if not, there's a fine or jail time. And that makes for a really great incentive to apply hard law. Now, with respect to AI or with technology in general, there are four ways in which a technology can push the boundaries of hard law, where it either needs to be created or modified. And this is something that I did not create. This is a really great researcher called Lyria Benet Moses. She identified this. And she identified that there's these regulatory gaps that are created in four ways. The first one is novelty. And novelty is a technology creates a new behavior and it's never happened before, and we need to regulate it. And there are many examples of this in the AI space. For instance, in semi-autonomous vehicles, how do we engage and disengage an autonomous vehicle or a semi-autonomous vehicle and let the human know that they need to step in? There's no regulations or there's no regulations for that. What's the lag in time that we need for that to happen? How do we make it so that humans actually respond? Is that going to be auditory? Is that going to be a vibration? Right now, there's nothing to control that. So that's completely novel because we've never had that situation before. We have an issue of uncertainty also when we don't know how to regulate a behavior, mainly because of several things, but maybe because two places in the same jurisdiction treat it differently, and that creates uncertainty between, well, which one is the right one? And at least in the US, we can think of freedom of speech. And what does freedom of speech means when it is not directly linked to a human, but to an AI? And what does a linkage to a human mean? Does a human have to be completely responsible for that speech? What if it's just a bot and the bot just spews all kind of information? Who is responsible for that? So there's a little bit of uncertainty for that. There's obsolescence as well. And obsolescence means that a law is no longer relevant because of the introduction of technology. And again, coming back to AVs, there's several examples of that. For instance, California has insurance standards where a really good driver is guaranteed savings in insurance rates. But what happens when we have completely autonomous vehicles and you're not responsible for driving that car anymore, and you get a perfect record, and everybody gets a perfect record regardless? That means that insurance companies in California are in danger, kind of the revenue is, because they don't expect everybody to get a 100% score on their insurance and everybody to get a discount. So that can be an example of obsolescence. And then the last one is targeting, where the technology is over or under included with the spirit of the law. And a really great example here is, again, sorry about bringing autonomous vehicles all the time, but in a state in the United States, if you're driving under the influence and somebody is killed, you have mandatory minimums of 10 or 15 years in jail. And one can foresee a situation where, let's say, Var, you and I go for a couple of drinks and we take too many, and I have a completely autonomous vehicle. And all I want to do is press start and take me home because I don't want to drive. And because of how laws are designed right now, I would be the proximate cause of that vehicle starting and taking me to a place. And if my vehicle makes a mistake and kills somebody, I would have to go to jail for 10, 15 years, regardless of the fact that I didn't drive the car. It's just the ways that the laws are written. And that, in a way, is over inclusion of these scenarios. So that's what we have with hard law. And it has its benefits, it has its drawbacks. But then, as you mentioned, I've done a lot of work in soft law. And the definition of soft law, and Gary Marchant is the main person in this world, and I worked under him in this project. And soft law is any program that creates substantive expectations but is not directly enforced by government. And as you said at the beginning, this includes a lot of things. It includes principles, it includes best practices, it includes standards, recommendations. There's many good and bad things about soft law. I think one of the bad things is that it is very difficult to force people to implement it. You and I, VAR, can create the VAR Carlos principles of AI governance, but how do we convince people to actually implement them? And that's something that we found, that out of the over 600 programs that we identified, only 29% had publicly facing implementation mechanisms. And out of those 29%, we found that there are really three incentives for applying soft law. And the three incentives, let's see if I can remember them. The first incentive was that, surprisingly, we found that government is the largest user of soft law out of the 600 programs. We didn't expect that. And government uses soft law as a boogie person for society. And it says, hey, if you don't apply this, I will make it hard law and I'll make it mandatory. So you better comply with it now when it's voluntary. This happens in a lot of situations. The second incentive is used by industry associations. And it tells government, hey, we're creating soft law. Don't regulate. Don't do anything because we've handled it. We've handled it ourselves. We don't need hard law because we can do it. There's many examples of this in the video game industry. This was used when Mortal Kombat had blood in video games, and government was thinking about creating laws, but the video game industry said, no, we will create our own rating system, and that is the current practice of the land. If you've seen these rating systems with adult or young people can use this game, that is completely soft law. And the last incentive for applying soft law is self-interest. Why self-interest? Well, self-interest divides into two places. Self-interest can be, hey, I want you to, I want to signal that my product is really good. And I want to signal that by means of a certification or a standard. And that signaling is really good because I can get new clients. That signaling is a way to showcase my products and make me more competitive than others. And then the second type is improving my internal structure. So improving my internal structure and limiting what could be really negative effects on my product. So as I mentioned before, if you apply a standard in the United States and you mess up, well, that can be a mitigating circumstance in U.S. courts, and my fine can be lower. Or I can use it to control third parties in my supply chain. Several businesses say, hey, I have these AI security standards. I need you to apply these in your components. And if you don't, I will fire you. And I will not have you be part of my supply chain because it's too much of a risk. And that happens all the time. So yeah, hard and soft law have different mechanisms. I am not a fundamentalist of having soft law work in all places at all times or prefer it over hard law. I think both have its benefits and drawbacks. And actually, in the EU AI Act, it includes a little bit of both, mostly hard law, but a little bit of soft law. And I think that's the right approach. I think we need flexibility. I think that despite us having a really clear sense of where AI is today, there are places where we don't know where it will be. Like, for instance, the main modalities of AI right now are text and audio and images, but those modalities can change in the near future. We can include different modalities in the form of different senses, such as smell and taste. And what does that mean for current approaches of AI governance? I think it means something completely different, and we need to be flexible.
Yeah, appreciate that. So, though I'm sad to hear that the VAR Carlos principles might not catch on, those findings on incentives from government, from industry associations, and on self-interested parties are really fascinating. I also want to go back to how the norm for the policy process is reactive, and there's often a good reason for that. But we've also seen policymakers make efforts to be proactive when it comes to these cutting-edge foundation models. So I'm talking about the White House. I'm talking about other national executives, as well as the network of AI safety institutes and the European AI Office. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the current state of international cooperation there, and what you see the ideal state looking like.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. The best way to not be reactive and to have foresight is to have any governance or management tool that is technology neutral. Many of the tools that we have in the executive order or that we have in other governance mechanisms are not technology neutral. There are compute thresholds or other elements that in a couple of years will be quaint and are coarse proxies for the things that we want to control. And these are things that are very difficult to implement. I mean, thinking about the compute governance ideals, how do you control that? How do you say, well, what if you used a federated compute where it's like parallel means of you get an AWS service and you don't use it in one node, but you use it in several nodes? And how do you take all those federations of things and actually calculate it? I mean, it's a very difficult thing when you don't depend only on hardware, but you use other third party services. I think it's very difficult to account for that. But going back to your question, right now we have a lot of international efforts. We have multilateral efforts in the form of the UN, of the OECD, JPA, G7, G20. We have a lot. We have a lot going on. And all of these processes, they have a particular characteristic is that they're super slow. They're very, very slow. Even for something that most people would believe there is a significant amount of agreement, such as should we or should we not use autonomous weapons and when and how. That process has been going on for several years, and there are different perspectives on definitional issues of what includes autonomous weapon systems and what are not autonomous weapon systems, and in what context should they be used. That has been a multi-party debate for a significant amount of time, and will continue to be one. And should we ban them? Should we not ban them? It's a difficult take. Now, despite the fact that these take a significant amount of time, they're incredibly important. And they're important because cooperation between countries is necessary. What we want to avoid is a race between countries because they haven't been useful in the past with technologies that affect the entire globe. Um, and cooperation is necessary. Now, what is the best way to do this? I think it's anybody's guess. There is no best way. I've proposed in a paper that what we need right now is coordination and capacity building in the form of maybe a UN agency that includes all countries, all countries, regardless of jurisdictional limitations that some organizations have. Hopefully under the aegis of the UN. And thinking about good parallels, I like Interpol, for instance. Interpol is an agency that has been incredibly successful in linking police departments throughout the world. So if an AI system in Japan spreads to other jurisdictions, for instance, in Brazil or in Mexico or in Panama, United States or Canada, well, who are the entities responsible in those countries with AI systems? I don't think we actually know who those entities are. How do we identify them? Yeah, I don't think that's very clear. And having that clear is a necessary condition for addressing these widely spreadable systems that can be used anywhere. And the second thing that I think is necessary is capacity building in the form of the WHO. For diseases, Ebola or COVID, the WHO has a lot of experience in going to different jurisdictions and building this capacity and building foresight into where this capacity will be necessary. And I think we need that for AI. Not every country outside of the US, Europe, and some places in Asia have this capacity to protect themselves against how these systems will affect different parts of the country. So I like those two. There are other alternatives that are really great or necessary, such as creating an IPCC for AI. But those two are my favorite, and that's why I wrote about them. So the state of the world right now is that we're at the beginning stages. It's going to take a long time. Are we going to have a treaty on AI anytime soon? I hope that is the case, but unlikely we will see it in the next 1 or 2 years.
Great. And I would encourage our listeners to take a look at Carlos's research and kind of engage with him if you have ideas on this. So since we're reaching the end of our time here, I'd love to ask you one more thing. For organizations getting started with their responsible AI journey, what would your main piece of advice be?
I think two. The first one is understand your limitations. One thing that I think entrepreneurs sometimes miss is the difference in language between creating or solving a problem and then navigating regulation, governance, compliance, assurance, assessment, audit. These are two different worlds. And sometimes this world of governance is put down a little bit because it seems like it's humans just arguing with each other. And you know what? I'm just going to pull out my product out there and have the governance follow me. And that is definitely an approach that has worked in some instances. There are successful cases. But for the vast majority of systems, understanding your limitations and addressing these things before a big fine comes or a big headache is incredibly important. And the second one is, don't feel afraid of failing. Failing is not only with your entrepreneurship idea, but failing in governance is incredibly common just because it is very different to the world that engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, not magicians, and scientists are usually accustomed to. Failing is important, and it's the usual part of business. It takes time to address these things, and realize that you're not the only entity going through this. There are several elements that are there to help you. For instance, in the US government, the AI RMF, or Risk Management Framework by NIST, is incredibly useful because what it does is that it creates all these questions that entities can answer in order to identify, well, what are the risks that I'm creating, and what are the risks that I should prioritize when thinking about putting out a product? So using these free tools is incredibly important, but also using knowledgeable third parties is a good and necessary practice in order to avoid headaches, which all parties will have.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those wise words, for joining us for this episode on soft law, and for all of your kind of dedication and research in this space. We really appreciate your time. And thanks also to our listeners. See you next time on the podcast.
Thank you, Var.